Hello, everybody. I am Christiana Limniadis, Director of Preservation Services for Preservation Buffalo Niagara. Thank you so much for joining us tonight at Landmark It or Lose It. While we are letting people into the room and getting situated, I just want to go over a few of the housekeeping and ground rules for how tonight is going to work. As you see on the screen, we're going to ask that everybody keep their microphones muted and their videos turned off. Even you, Linda, if you want to turn your video off, that way that everyone can have the screen clear and focusing on the information at hand tonight. We have several different speakers that are going to go through tonight, so we just want to make sure that this goes as smoothly as possible. In addition to keeping your microphones muted and video turned off, this is a community meeting that we're having tonight, so we want to make sure that we are all providing a professional, friendly space and welcoming environment for everyone to learn about landmarking and what is happening in the Elmwood Village and the possible solutions for that. So we will not be tolerating unacceptable behaviors as listed on the screen in front of you. If you are unable to follow these rules, then you risk consequences for that, including immediate removal from this meeting and restrictions on future PBN or REV meetings with us. So please, let's all follow the rules and have a lovely, wonderful evening of talking about landmarking. And so let us start. Before I throw it to our first presenter, I know that in the chat box, I can see that everyone has been putting in the street that they live in, and it's great to give us an opportunity to see where everyone is located in the Elmwood Village. So thank you so much for putting that in there. And without further ado, I'm going to kick it off to our first speaker tonight, who is Gretchen Sircone. And I actually forgot how you wanted me to introduce you, your title.
Oh, that's fine.
Gretchen, there you go. I will mute and hide myself, and you let me know when you want to move slides.
All right, thanks, Christy. Everyone, thank you for joining us tonight. Even though my screen says James Sircone because I forgot my computer at work today, I am Gretchen Sircone, and I am one of the people in a leadership role of a group called Residents of the Elmwood Village. Catherine Faust is also one of the founders and leaders of that organization with me. We felt that there was a bit of a vacuum in the Elmwood Village, a vacuum of leadership and advocacy several years back when the Elmwood Village Association was experiencing a lot of turnover in its leadership, and there had really been there was a voice missing at the table when development projects were coming forward in the city, and specifically in our neighborhood. So we formed this group called Residents of the Elmwood Village. We have a Facebook page, which hopefully if you are a resident of the Elmwood Village, you are part of already, or you're welcome to join. We're just short of 1,000 members. We only need 3 more. We're at 957, so we're really close. And I'm just going to go through a little bit about what our group does very quickly, because it does contribute to the conversation that we're going to have about the need for a local historic district in the Elmwood Village. So I'm good with this slide.
And Gretchen, actually, I'm just going to interrupt you because I forgot one of the major housekeeping things that I was going to say in the beginning was that because your microphones are muted and your video is turned off, the way that we would like you to ask questions, because we want you to ask questions, you're going to learn and hear a lot of information tonight, so you're definitely going to have questions, is through the chat function. So if you're new to using Zoom, if you just wiggle your mouse around, there should be a little menu bar that pops up, and there should be a little chat icon. And so you're going to click on that, the chat function that you're putting your streets in. That's how you're going to put in any questions that you have. We are going to save all of the questions for the end portion of this program. So we have a moderator here. My coworker Tia is collecting all of the questions and everything that you're putting into the chat. So feel free at any moment to write that question in there, and we will come back to that at the end. Thank you. Now.
All right, I'm ready for the next slide. Thanks. So some of the things that we've done are kind of grassroots advocacy, where we have brought petitions to City Hall. We've met with the mayor. We've met with our council members. We created the no wrecking ball signs to put out, and that was initially for the really terrifyingly bad project that was proposed at Elmwood and Bidwell, but it has continued to work. We're asking, obviously from the sign here, to stop knocking things down and enforce the city's green code. Catherine and I were part of the group that helped to customize the green code for the Elmwood Village. And part of that does relate to demolitions, which I'll talk to you about in a couple of minutes. So advocacy is one piece of what we do. I'm ready. We want to seek preservation of the neighborhood. So you can see working with our new state senator, Sean Ryan, working with our representatives in the city, attending planning board, zoning board, preservation board meetings, and really engaging with the community and trying to do outreach so that people realize that their voice does matter and that our neighborhood matters and the historic value needs to be preserved. So these are some examples of the community organizing that we've done, holding neighborhood meetings around large and small projects in the city, in our little corner of the city here, with the Children's Hospital reuse. We held a meeting about 4 years ago regarding preservation in the Elmwood Village and looking at what the different options were in order to try to reduce the demolitions and to have better design in the city. So we are revisiting that conversation tonight because unfortunately, since we had that meeting, we've really seen the decimation of a lot of the fabric of Elmwood Avenue itself. And then what's becoming a little more frightening is on the side streets where developers are acquiring homes and knocking a couple down, building an apartment building to increase their profit. And we assert ourselves as the developers of the Elmwood Village as well. We spend our money here. We purchase houses that may have been in very bad shape and do our best to rehabilitate those houses without the resources that Simonelli, Palladino, Sinatra, without the resources that they have. And we really feel like if we can do it, they can certainly do it as well. So I want to show you some examples of, in the last several years, houses that we have lost, not despite lots of effort on the part of the community. This is 647 Lafayette. These are the photos of the interior that were taken when it was sold to the owners who had it demolished. And as you can see, it doesn't appear to be in serious disrepair. There was a family that had lived in that house for many, many years before, and it certainly was not unsafe. But despite all of the community organizing, despite the advocacy that we had around this, preserving this home, it was demolished, and there really was no regulatory lever to give the neighborhood power or any sort of a voice that would stick to preserve that home. There was a strip of houses at Elmwood and Forest, which were also demolished, and several of those homes were National Register contributing structures. And again, there's mixed feelings about these houses, mixed feelings maybe about that project. However, the bottom line is what we need to have is a regulatory body in the city, the Preservation Board, that are experts that make the decisions as to what happens to historic homes. Neighbors on either sides of a room, saying contradictory things to each other is not productive. We need to have the experts, the historic architects, the people who this is their life's work. They need to be the ones making the judgment about whether homes can be preserved or whether they can't. And that is one of the most important features of the local historic district. Right now, the Preservation Board could vote to save all of the houses that I'm going to show you, and they have voted that way. And at the end of the day, their decision is not binding. And so the houses can come down anyway, regardless of what their viewpoint is. And that is something that definitely needs to change. These homes at 619 and 621 West Delavan, there was a proposal put forward. It was approved by the city. the houses were demolished, and you can see that now it remains, it is actually labeled a parking lot for 905 Elmwood. A parking lot was not approved plan for this property. We were told that those houses were in disrepair and that there would be a beautiful new project in its place. And here we have, years later, no consequences for Ellicott Development, who has continued to leave this as a vacant hole in the fabric of West Delavan Avenue. These homes were demolished as well as part of the Children's Hospital reuse. What was really shocking, I think, to many of us around this was that 184 West Utica, and you can see a little bit of the historic blurb about the house there and the specifics that made it such a historic home, was actually voted and approved to be landmarked, to become a historic landmark. It was still demolished, despite that we were not able to take that process all the way through to the end, to fruition. It had been approved by the Preservation Board as a landmark, and I think it was within hours, it was within days at the most, that home was demolished. And again, once the house is down, there's not really much that you can do. We can't to backtrack on that. So it's become very clear, instead of running in this hamster wheel where we're trying to do so much work, and at the end of the day, when you don't have a regulation, don't have legislation at the city level to enforce the Preservation Board's decisions, these houses, we are losing them tens at a time over the years. This is the most recent home that has been demolished. This was at 878 Elmwood. This is also for an Ellicott Development project. What I want to highlight about this particular instance is that most of these homes that are being purchased are not being put up for sale. If you put this house up for sale on Elmwood, I feel 100% sure that someone would purchase it. The developers are approaching homeowners, offering them this particular house. They offered $120,000 over what the value of the house was. Then had the nerve to go to the city boards and say they couldn't afford to rehabilitate it. So they paid 120 grand over what the value of the house was, but can't afford to fix what they said were structural issues. A historic architect on the Preservation Board offered pro bono to go look at the home with the developers and evaluate how stable it was, and that was refused repeatedly. So again, what we have here is a Preservation Board voting against the demolition, and this house is now gone. And what is concerning is that the vacant lot next to it is what Ellicott proposed to have become a parking lot for their restaurant at 905 Elmwood. And now they have two vacant lots together, and we have no idea if that project will actually come to fruition or not. So just to summarize on as far as why we are where we are right now, I know that there are questions about a historic district, but the problem that we have at this point is we don't have any leverage in order to prevent the demolitions from continuing to happen. We have literally tried, I think, everything. Other people in our organization have said they will chain themselves to porches. I mean, we have really tried everything in our power, and it's become very clear that the option of the local historic district is what's going to save the fabric of the Elmwood Village. So I've just pulled up here, it's from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, just what some of the benefits are of a local historic district. There's some, I've heard some people say, you know, our property values are gonna go down because no one's gonna wanna have to jump through the hoops of a local district. And in fact, the opposite is the case. When you look at homes on Linwood, you look at homes in Allentown, Hamlin Park, the homes on Broadway, Fillmore, those are homes, their property values have actually increased because of the designation of a local historic district. It's environmentally sound. Instead of sending a house to a landfill and building something else in its place, it makes more sense to utilize the resources that are already there. You can go to the next one, please. Thank you. Not to mention the fact that, you know, you don't see people walking on Niagara Falls Boulevard with coffee in their hand, doing their shopping along the road. But you do see that on Elmwood. The fabric of our neighborhood, the rhythm of our streets, that is what brings people into the Elmwood Village to have lunch, to meet their friends, to do their shopping, to have a beer, whatever the case may be. That is because of when you're walking, you've probably ridden your bike on St. James, or you've walked on Chapin Parkway. And it is the fact that there are the houses, and you're thinking, I've never noticed that on that house before. It impacts the local economy, whether it's through tourism, whether it's through people coming to shop or patronize the businesses. We owe it to the small business owners on Elmwood Avenue to seek this designation. It protects them from developers coming in, knocking down where their storefronts are, and then charging exorbitant rents where they are not able to afford. So from a resident standpoint, I hope that I've explained why, having explored many, many options, we've come to the conclusion that a local historic district really is the best mechanism to put in place to preserve not only our homes, but also the small businesses that are along Elmwood Avenue. So I am not the preservation expert. That is Jessie Fisher, who is the executive director of Preservation Buffalo Niagara. And before I hand it over to her, I just want to say that the work that Preservation Buffalo Niagara has done and continues to do is absolutely incredible. If you can contribute to them, if you can't attend their events, they have brought attention to parts of the history of our city that have been long overlooked, LGBTQ historic sites in the city, looking at places like Willard Park, calling attention to Grant Street and studying the preservation possibilities there. So I just want to thank Preservation Buffalo Niagara for co-hosting this with us tonight, for all of the work that you do in all parts of the city, not only with us. And with that, I will hand it over to my heroine of preservation, the hero of Buffalo, Jessie Fisher.
Aw, thanks, Gretchen. That was nice. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for attending tonight. As Gretchen said, I am Jessie Fisher. I'm the Executive Director of Preservation Buffalo Niagara. But before I got a degree in urban planning and before I took this job about 5 years ago, what I always say to people is I became an urban planner when I was in my 20s. Or I got my urban planning degree when I was in my 20s, but I actually became an urban planner when I moved on to Norwood Avenue into our little blue house just south of West Utica Street. And that really taught me what community is about and how supportive specific types of neighborhoods can be. And I really just became a lifelong passionate supporter of healthy neighborhoods. And preservation is a big part of that. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, I won't belabor the point, but we do serve the 5 counties of Western New York. So not just the city of Buffalo, but we actually work in Chautauqua County and Niagara County. We have very special mission-based work in the city of Buffalo and the city of Niagara Falls, but we do work all over the 5 counties of Western New York. Our mission is to identify, protect, and promote the unique architecture and historic legacy of Western New York and connect people to the places they love. We are not neutral. We are a mission-based nonprofit, so we believe in historic preservation. We believe that it's a big part of making communities stronger, more resilient, more connected, and that's not based on how we feel. That's based on, decades of peer-reviewed studies, as Gretchen was pointing out earlier. But while we might not be neutral, and while we are passionate supporters of historic preservation and deeply knowledgeable on the subject, we are not here to tell you what to do with your neighborhood. That's not our job. We are here to help you do what you want to do from your neighborhood and be a technical partner to you and your community. So if you think that a local historic district is an important part of this community taking the next steps to protect its fabric and to continue to be the diverse and welcoming community that it is, then we're here to help you take those next steps. And we're pleased and ecstatic to do that. So before I go to my next slides, though, I think Tia or Christy is going to put up a quick survey. I'm curious, we have about 30 participants, it looks like, and I'm curious, as Christy and I go through the technical parts of our preservation, what you actually already know about this neighborhood in terms of its preservation status. So Tia or Christy, if you could throw that survey up on the screen.
I already did it, Jessie, and everyone participated.
Oh, they did. Oh,
yeah,
excellent. Let's see the results.
Okay, the results, let me pull them up.
So I was wondering if people were aware what the status of the neighborhood now is, because I do still sometimes talk to folks who are a little bit confused. So before I know how long to talk about this issue, I just want to know what people know already.
And 18% neither.
Oh wait, I didn't hear what you said. Can you start over?
Yeah,
sorry.
I'm sorry. We have 53% for a National Register district, 24% a local historic district, 6% say, what's the difference? And 18% say neither.
Okay, excellent. Well, 53% of you were correct. We can advance the slide, Christy, to the next slide. Thanks, Tia. So right now, Elmwood Avenue is a National Register Historic District. So you can see the boundaries of that district on the slide that on my screen is on the right. All that area in pink that someone is so helpfully outlining for you is the National Register Historic District, which is what Elmwood is. It was actually done in 2 phases. Some of you might remember this. There was the west of Elmwood was done first, and then the east side was done. And you can see how it kind of bleeds over into the Allentown district to the south, and a little bit over towards Linwood. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about what that means. So National Register, which is what you are, is a designation that we can't give to ourselves here in the city of Buffalo. It has to be done for us by the State Historic Preservation Office and by the National Park Service. So there was quite an extensive effort that was underway. And I think I noticed Alma Brown is on the call. And so one of your neighbors was one of the primary consultants who really worked on getting that designation. It was several years of work. And now the Elmwood Village is on the National Register. That's really a largely honorary designation. There's not really any regulations that come with that, which is why a lot of folks didn't even realize that it was a district, because it really doesn't affect your life in any way. But you should be aware, because there are some pretty significant financial incentives in New York State. This isn't true in every state, but in New York State, in the city of Buffalo, there are tax credits and grants that are available for properties that are in National Register Historic Districts that aren't available for properties that are not. And so when you see a lot of the historic redevelopment projects happening across the city and bigger buildings, a lot of that is because the commercial developers have figured out how to use these historic tax credits, but that's also available to you as an individual homeowner. And PBN does a free monthly workshop to help you take advantage of those tax credits. So you can go to our website or sign up for, like us on Facebook, and you'll get more information, and you're always welcome to attend those. Don't do any work on your house unless you look into those tax credits, because it really can result in quite a substantial savings. But like I said, the big thing is there's really no regulatory. So if you don't want to use the tax credits, your life stays completely the same. Where the regulation comes in, which is how we, what Gretchen was alluding to in terms of if we want to have demolition review or review of new projects in historic districts, that only comes into play in local historic districts. So Allentown is a local historic district. Linwood Avenue, where I live, is a local historic district. There are several of them throughout the city. This is a designation of the city. It's actually in the city charter. It's section 337 of the city charter. If you want to look it up and read it yourself, I'm sure Christy will go over it later. And it is both honorary in the sense that it really does create this list of these are the special historic places in our city. And it's also regulatory. So it celebrates the history, but there's also some permit review. And Christy will talk about that in more detail. There really aren't any direct financial incentives for being in a local historic district. PBN does have a small revolving loan fund that's for lower income folks who live in historic districts, but as a general rule, there's not a huge amount of financial incentive. And the other big difference, a National Register district, there has to be, if it's an individual resource, the owner itself has to approve it. If it's a district, there has to be approval by a majority of the residents. In a local historic district, that's actually not the case. Owner approval is not required, although because of the way the city of Buffalo works, the process for getting a local historic district is first the Preservation Board approves it. And secondarily, the Common Council has to approve it. And so every council district is a little bit different, but there needs to be generally support for the district before an elected council person is going to vote for it. So that's a really critical thing to keep in mind. Christy, you want to advance the slides? So just to reiterate, I'm not going to talk about certified local districts. It doesn't really apply to you guys, but National Registered District, which is what you are now, doesn't really offer any protection from demolition. That's how come you end up in those really frustrating situations where everyone heads downtown to the Preservation Board and says, please don't tear down this house. And the Preservation Board says, okay, we will vote against tearing down this house. And then 30 days later, the house gets torn down. That's because that in a National Register district, the Preservation Board vote is only advisory. There's no regulatory teeth there. However, in a local historic district, again, like Allentown, like Linwood, if the Preservation Board votes no on the demolition, then it doesn't happen. So they actually have a regulatory role to play in that. Protection from non-compatible new development. So a local historic district, they don't just review demolition, they also review new buildings. So for instance, a great recent example on the corner of Linwood and Lafayette is a new People Inc. development. That project looks very different now than it did when it was first proposed, because the Preservation Board had a say in how that new building was being built, because it was being built in the Linwood Avenue Historic District. And so it needed to be compatible from a design sense with the rest of the district. And so it resulted in larger porches and some other things that really helped it fit in better with the neighborhood. So that's what local historic districts can do. Again, financial incentives, you already have those, so please take advantage of them because you're in a National Register Historic District. That won't change if we also layer in a local historic district. Input into government decision-making, not really. When there's a project with federal funds, sometimes there's a little bit more of a say when you're in a National Register District, but where there really is input into local government decision-making is in local historic districts. Again, that's where that regulatory arm comes through. That's where you really, as citizens and residents of the community, have a stronger voice. And then again, the permit review, and Christy will go through this in much more detail. There's no permit review in National Register districts, and there is a little extra layer of permit review in the local districts. Christy, is that my final slide?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so I know Gretchen introduced me as the expert, but I'm not. That's a secret. Our real expert is Christiana Limniadis. If you have attended our tax credit workshops, Christy does all the presenting, and she's probably helped you out on your application because she's nice like that. So Christiana is our director of preservation services, and she's going to walk you through just the day-to-day nuts and bolts of what will change for you if you do decide you want to become a local historic district. So without further ado, Christy.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so Jesse did a great job at introducing in broad strokes what a local historic district is, but let's get into kind of the nitty gritty of it. So how are we even able to landmark and create historic districts? It's because of that preservation ordinance that we have on the books. It was first established and added to our city code in 1974. So this is not a new fangled thing to create landmarks or historic districts. We've been doing it since the 70s, Chapter 337. The ordinance not only allows and has the procedures for designating individual landmarks and historic districts, but for regulating exterior changes to those landmarked properties. So any exterior changes, any new construction would have to go before the Preservation Board for review. Since 1974, the city has designated more than 136 individual properties now, because the most recent meetings haven't been added into these totals. And then there are 16 historic districts across the city. On this slide, you'll see on the left-hand side, the white and purple map is the city's official map of all of the historic districts and individual landmarks. The dark purple ones are the individual landmarks. The light purple are the historic districts. Of those 16 historic districts, the vast majority of them are actually parkland. Our park system is a historic district here in the city, and a lot of commercial and industrial districts. There's the Joseph Ellicott district that comprises a lot of downtown. There's the Larkinville Historic District. So when we kind of ignore those districts for a moment, here are the, what is that, 9, 6, 7, 8 historic districts that are primarily residential in makeup. So if the Elmwood Village would does move forward to become a local historic district, you'd be with your fellow Allentown residents, Linwood residents, West Village, Broadway Fillmore, Hamlin Park residents in being underneath the Preservation Board overview for exterior changes of your property. In all, there are about a little less than 4,000 tax parcels in the city of Buffalo that fall under the Preservation Board review process. To create a landmark, whether it's an individual building or a historic district, you have to meet the criteria for designation. And that criteria is outlined in the ordinance itself. There are 9 separate criteria to be eligible for designation for landmarking. You have to meet at least one of those criteria. As you can see on the screen, they're kind of vague and general criteria for eligibility. So most often landmarks and historic districts meet several of these individual criteria at the same time. So you have to meet those criteria to be eligible. Once you've evaluated your individual landmark or your historic district in this case for eligibility, then you can start that actual nomination process. So that first step is with an application. It's a very simple 2-page application of kind of fill in the blank things, which you then include as an attachment your narrative history of your resource, whether it's an individual site or your historic district. So you have all of that information explaining and justifying how that historic district meets one or more of those criteria for designation. Once you've prepared that application, it's submitted to the Preservation Board. There is an application fee associated with nominating landmarks or historic districts. It is a $500 fee if you are not the individual owner of the property. So as soon as you hand over your paperwork and your check to the city, the Preservation Board accepts that application. And the first step is that they review it for completeness. So that means that the Preservation Board would, at one of their regular Thursday meetings, review the application to make sure that it includes all of the information that they would need to evaluate whether or not it meets the criteria. So making sure it's not missing critical information or maps or other types of documentation that helps explain why that resource, why that historic district is important. Once they've deemed that application complete, then it would move on to being scheduled for a public hearing. And so that is an opportunity for the public and certainly the individuals who have nominated this resource to give their testimony and opinion on why and how this resource successfully meets those criteria for designation. So there would be that public hearing that was held. There's public notices that are sent out and mailed to the houses that would be affected by that nomination or neighboring those nominations. It's published in newspapers and put on certainly the city's website to notify the public for this opportunity to voice your opinion and provide testimony in that. Once that public hearing has been completed and all of the individuals who wish to speak have had, or all the individuals have had opportunity to mail in either by email or snail mail written remarks on the hearing, then the Preservation Board will close that public hearing and make their decision. The Preservation Board's decision is not a yes or no on landmarking. Their decision is actually a recommendation of yes or no to the Common Council for them to make this a landmark. The Preservation Board is the advisory. They are the smart preservation people that give their advice to our elected officials of whether or not they should vote to make this a landmark. So their decision is to recommend the resource for landmark status or historic district status, or not to recommend it. If they do find it eligible and successfully meeting all of those criteria, then they will pass that on to the Common Council. First, when it gets to the Common Council, it will go to the Legislation Committee for review, and where they will then have their own public hearing, just as there was a public hearing in the Preservation Board. So we have that second public hearing with the Legislation Committee, and then the Legislation Committee makes their recommendation to the Common Council for how the Common Council should vote on that item. And then once it moves through that level, it then goes to a full Common Council meeting for a full vote where it is voted to be created as a landmark or historic district or not. So that is the entire process in a nutshell. Once things are nominated, once things are voted on by the Common Council and made a landmark or a historic district, then that is when the regulation aspect kicks in. So again, the regulation aspect is that any exterior changes to a landmark property would have to go before the Preservation Board. And when we say before the Preservation Board, it means that they need to have a certificate given to them by this Preservation Board. So you would need your permit for whatever work you're doing on the exterior of your building, and you would also then need that certificate saying that the Preservation Board approved of the work. So how that would work in your project, you're doing an improvement project on the outside of your building, you go to City Hall and you get any necessary permits that you need for that project. And then you would also need to go down to the Preservation Board's office, which is on the 9th floor, which maybe right now we're not physically going into the building to do that, but you have the 3rd floor, which is your permits office, and then the 9th floor, which is your preservation office. And you need to submit your application for certificate. I'll show you in the next slide what that application looks like, but it's where you explain to the Preservation Board what your project is, how your project would alter or what changes you're making to the exterior, and you include all of your photo documentation or paperwork or whatever you need to show the Preservation Board what your project is. Once that application is received by that office, there's 2 paths for that application. One path is a staff approval, where you would get what's called a certificate of no effect, meaning that the project you're proposing, the project that they've approved for you, really does not have any effect. There's no effect on the permanent change, on the permanent exterior of that building. So we're talking about projects that are very small repairs or projects that are replacing in kind. So an example of that would be doing your roof. If you currently have asphalt shingle roofs on your roof and you're just putting a new one on, then your application would most likely get a quick staff approval to just put on that new roof. The other course that your application could go would be to have to go before the full Preservation Board at one of their Thursday meetings. And that's usually reserved for projects that are larger projects that involve multiple different types of scopes of work. It's not just a simple roof redo or a simple repair to a broken element on your porch, but a larger rehabilitation project or a project that does include changes to materials. So whereas a certificate of no effect, a staff approval is about replacing in kind. You have this piece of wood on your house, you're putting a new piece of wood exactly the same way, that's a no effect. But if you're changing out materials, as if, one example would be if you currently have a slate roof and you want to change out that historic original material for a new modern version of that material, then it would have to go to the Preservation Board for their approval at one of their meetings. Here is what that application form looks like. It's available on the city's website. And I think we're going to put in the chat box the link to the Preservation Board's website where you can get access to this form. But it is a very simple form. You fill out the information on top about you and your project. And then the rest of the paperwork kind of is a guidelines to help you, a checklist, if you will, of what information you need to provide to them for your project. So here you have on the form, it says if you're doing something involving windows, doors, or siding, these are the things that they expect to see as part of your application. If you're doing a roofing project, these are the things that they expect to see as part of your application. So that's all of the application paperwork that you would submit in. When we talk about how they are going to review your project, there are, review criteria listed in the ordinance, but what that review criteria refers to is that the Preservation Board is going to use what's called the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation to review your project. So these, the SOI, the Secretary of the Interior Standards, they are standards and guidelines created by the National Park Service to help and to provide, preservation best practices and standards for rehabilitating a property. So when we say that we're going to rehabilitate it, it means that it allows for modern changes so that we can have continued use of your property. But the recommendations and the guidelines are going to help you make sure that we retain those character defining features that make your property special. The whole point and the whole, there's the historic significance that makes Elmwood Village, the Elmwood neighborhood important. And then there's the architectural elements. And so those architectural elements make you eligible for landmarking. So we want to make sure we retain those things. So as you can see on the screen, the essential, the basic concept of what it means to follow those standards of rehabilitation is to retain, repair, and replace in kind. So all of your work, we want to strive to our best abilities to keep all of those character defining features, those original historic materials, and to repair them. If repairing is not possible, which often happens, materials have a lifespan, so you can only repair a piece of wood so many times, you might need to introduce new modern materials. And these standards and guidelines will help guide you into choosing appropriate materials for those replacement needs. Excellent. I think that is what I'm going to say about that. So next couple of slides, we're just going to cover some of the typical questions that we get about local historic districts. Certainly, I'm sure that some of the questions you have in the chat right now are overlapping with these, so we'll just go over these kind of usual suspect questions. So the first one up at the top, the yellow colored one, am I going to be told what color I can paint my house? No, with a local historic district or a locally landmarked property here in the city of Buffalo, we do not regulate paint color. The color of paint is cosmetic. It can change. This year my house is yellow, next year my house is blue. It doesn't dramatically change the materiality of my house, the form of my house. It's a cosmetic change. So the city of Buffalo does not regulate the color of paint. There are moments where the Preservation Board does regulate the color of something, but that is really reserved for just those materials that you might be using where the color is a permanent aspect of that material. So if you have a masonry home, you have a brick house, a stone house, and you need to make repairs and replace some of those deteriorated pieces of brick or stone elements, they're going to help and guide you to make sure that you're choosing the correct tone of brick, the correct shade of stone, so that it's sympathetic to the rest of the stone and masonry that you have on your structure. So there are times where color is regulated, but not in paint. That is purely cosmetic. Next question up at the top, will local designation make my property taxes go up? And the answer is no. There is no change in the mathematical equation used to figure out what your assessment value is and what your property taxes are that changes when you become a historic district. There is no magic wand or special column in a spreadsheet that says, well, now that you're historic, we tax you differently. That is not happening. Gretchen had already mentioned earlier in her portion how there are actually studies that show that local historic districting actually help to stabilize property taxes because of the regulation, that extra little review that has to happen. Usually and studies across the nation have shown this, usually scare away those big, huge pie in the sky kind of projects that usually cause those very, very high peaks in tax assessments and property taxes, and those really, really low, the low points that can happen, the ebbs and flows in those, whereas local historic districting has shown to kind of stabilize and create a slow and steady incline in the value of properties. But there is not going to be an automatic change in your property taxes if you are suddenly, you become historic. Bottom question, is it going to cost me more now to make alterations to my property? And the answer to that is no, because there is really no way to know how much your rehabilitation, your project is going to cost, because the cost of your project is such a personal thing and so dependent on what condition your house is in, what types of materials you have on your house. So the cost is much more related to what you have right now and what you would like to do with your property, and not so much connected and related to whether or not you're a historic district or not. You know, we don't have the time this evening to really get into the nitty-gritty of the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, but if you join me on one of my monthly tax credit workshops, you know, we do kind of go into that deep dive of showing how those standards are written to allow flexibility so you can maintain reasonably priced projects. So, but on a flat value, no, there's not going to be an automatic extra cost because you're historic now for your rehabilitation projects. And then that last question in the bottom, are there any incentives available for properties in historic districts? As we've already covered, as Jesse discussed, because you guys are already a National Register Historic District, you already have access to the major financial incentive that exists, which are historic tax credits. So as a National Register District, you already have access to those credits. As a local historic district, there is not a new incentive that pops up, unfortunately, as Jesse mentioned, and I think Tia will put in the chat right now. We do have a historic home loan fund. It is focused on low-income property owners and has some other eligibility requirements from that, but that program is only open to locally landmarked properties. So if you did meet the other eligibility requirements of that program, that would be a financial incentive available to you. But unfortunately, other than that, there are no other financial incentives that exist. When you guys registered for tonight's program, on your form, there was a spot where people could put in some questions. And so here are, there was a lot of repeats of questions. So it's really just main 4 questions that were proposed in those, but I just wanted to go over these questions right now as well. And the first one was, would this include just Elmwood or all of the side streets? And so definitely, like Jesse said, we are here to be your technical advisor. You as a community, you as the Elmwood Village need to come together and decide, you know, do we want to do this local landmark? Do we want it to be a historic district that's just the commercial strip? Do we want it to include all the side streets? So that is definitely a question for you as the residents. But as the technical advisor for you, to give you our best advice, the most logical choice would be to have the local historic district line up with the National Register Historic District. There are lots of examples, you know, across the state, across the nation, and here in the city of Buffalo, where we have had local historic districts and national level historic districts of the same geographic area have different boundaries. And it just caused so much confusion that homeowners were unsure of which district am I in, which district has what associated with it. So to just ease all of those issues, to have both levels of designation maintain the same boundaries so that everybody in the district has access to the same financial incentives and benefits of the National Register program, and then also fall under that extra review process for demolitions and new developments on the local side. So from a technical point of view, our advice would be to create a local historic district that has those same boundaries. Next question, would a local historic district impact renters and landlords? The short answer for that is no. Again, I think it's really important to understand that the preservation ordinance is just like any other zoning overlay that exists in the city. Whereas traditional zoning regulates the use that happens on that lot, that happens in that building. Preservation ordinance regulates the building itself, the exterior of that building. So it is applied to all the buildings in that historic district equally. It does not matter or care who is the owner or what type of use is in there. The focus is on the building itself and making sure that we are retaining those character defining features and that we are not negatively impacting the character of individual buildings and the historic district as a whole. So there isn't any sort of special thing that happens to renters and landlords. Everyone is under those same regulations independent. The thing to keep in mind if you are a renter in a locally designated property is that if your arrangement with the landlord is that you are able to do repairs on the exterior of the building, then you need to make sure you are following the law and getting the approvals that you need, because you risk fines and trouble and issues, and we don't want troubles and issues. So if you are doing exterior repairs as a renter, you need to be aware of these regulations. How would it impact developers? Again, it is equally applied to all property owners. So just as you as a homeowner, if you want to do something to the exterior of your house, you need to go down to City Hall and get your appropriate permits and your preservation board approval. So then do those developers have to get their permits and get the preservation board approval. It creates an equal playing field, an even line for everyone to put forward their projects and to get that input and approval from the preservation board. And then that last question, which we did kind of already talk about, is do property owners need to agree to landmarking for it to happen? And the answer is no. On the local level, the way that the preservation ordinance is written, the way that the New York State Historic Preservation Office and our Preservation League of New York State have created their model draft ordinances as an example for all the communities of New York State, it is not usually part of preservation ordinances to require owner approval, because again, the whole point of this is evaluating and prioritizing our historic built environment, and it's saying that we value these resources and we want to keep them here. So the focus is on whether or not those resources meet that criteria and successfully meet that criteria, and not necessarily the whim of a current property owner and whether they wish to be landmarked or not. It's the focus is on the building, the resources themselves. And I just put this map of Elmwood Village again, because I was going to show that when I discussed the boundaries, and I totally forgot that I had this slide there. So again, when we're talking about getting to that point, hopefully down the line where we would be talking about writing and creating that local historic district, the best technical step would be to have those boundaries mimic and parallel the existing National Register boundaries. And with that, that is the end of all of the technical things. So I'll invite Jesse to come back, and then we can have Tia let us know of questions that have come up throughout the evening.
Hello, everyone. This is Tia. So I think Christy covered a couple of these. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think Christy covered a couple of these questions, and I do think that they're intertwined. But so it's first, why would we not want to have a local historic district? I understand that a developer won't want it, but why would a resident be against it? And then, yeah, so if you could just go into that, basically. Yeah. I mean, you talked a little bit about the restrictions that come with fixing a house and making changes to a home and residential properties and things like that.
Yeah, honestly, I'll answer that question as somebody who lives in a local historic district and has for 20 years. I don't think I think the reason that people generally oppose that and there is a knee-jerk reaction is because of fear and because of concern of that additional regulatory burden that people perceive. But as I think Christy talked about, and we've done, and we'd be happy to come back and do for you, a deeper dive just on the very specifics of like, how do you move through the process? But the truth is most homeowners don't move through the process. You hire a contractor, right? So if you're getting a new roof on your house, you will never, unless Christy said you have this very, very particular circumstances, which 99% of you in the Elmwood Village do not have. But if you have an asphalt shingle roof and it's just the end of the life of your roof and you need to get a new one, you're going to hire Daylex or somebody. That's not an endorsement. It's just the first one that popped in my head. And they're going to go down to the 3rd floor of City Hall, and 3rd floor is going to say, oh, historic district, and they're going to walk up to the 9th floor. Chris Hawley is going to look at that application and he's going to say, oh, this roof looks exactly like the old roof, and he's going to stamp it, and they're going to go back down to the 3rd floor, pick up their permit. You'll never even know that it happened. And that's the way a lot of projects are. Now, if you have a big original porch and you want to tear your porch off, yep, you're going to go before that preservation board or your architect is, and they're going to have to talk about it, and they're going to have, more questions and things of that nature. But, I think that short answer is people are concerned about the regulatory burden. Our answer would be like, it doesn't affect, most of it. I just checked in with Chris Hawley today, who is the staff person for the City of Buffalo Preservation Board. And this year they have done staff approvals on about 2/3 of all applications that come to them. So it's really only about 1/3 of the applications that are in these much larger categories of either a new build within a local historic district or a really major project, a major rehab, a major renovation of a project that go to the full preservation board. So 2/3 of the time, you're not going to have that increased regulatory burden. At least that's going to be noticeable to you. But you will get those protections. So, that's typically how I would answer that question.
And you wouldn't say that it's difficult. It's not painful to go through the process of trying to.
It's hard to answer that question in the abstract because, again, I think, yes, if you are trying to tear down a house and build a new thing it's going to be a longer process. You're going to go through a lot more. So on that sense, yes, if the project that was proposed at the corner of Elmwood and Bidwell, it's probably going to take a long time to get that process through. They're talking about tearing down, 4 or 5 houses that would now be in a local historic district and building a building that's much larger than anything else that's there. That could be a painful process and it could get rejected. The Preservation Board really takes its job seriously. It's made up of, just so people are aware of who the Preservation Board is. It is made up of a lot of professionals. There are appointees of the mayor on that board. There are appointees of the Common Council on that board. And then the History Museum has an appointee on that board, and Preservation Buffalo Niagara has an appointee on that board. Our appointee is a historic preservation architect active in the city of Buffalo here. So, it's a board that's made up of professionals and they take their job seriously. So again, they're only going to be involved, the board itself, if it's a big project. You're tearing down a house, you're adding a big addition to the front of your house where it's really going to impact the look of the district, those kinds of things. You want to take out your original stained glass. Those kinds of things are going to go through more of a process. If you're painting your house, if you're putting on a new roof, if you're repairing your porch.
Simple repairs to your porch, the things that you would do every year to make sure your house is okay. Those
vinyl windows.
Again, we can't answer that blanketly, sorry, one way or the other. It's going to depend. If you do not have original windows in your house, the other thing I always like to point out to people, they're not going to make you go backwards. If the original fabric is already missing, if you already have replacement windows in your house, they're not going to make you go out and build, identical windows. So as Christy said, it's all about repair and replace in kind. So if you already have vinyl windows, not really going to have an issue putting vinyl windows back in. If you have original windows and you do want to take those out, first of all, attend one of our workshops. Don't do that. It's more expensive for you over the long run, and it doesn't help you with your energy costs. I know the salesman's going to tell you that. He's lying to you. So come see us first. But should you make that poor decision to do that, you might have a little bit of an issue at the Preservation Board, and they'll want to talk to you about it. But again, their goal is to keep houses standing, is to keep you in your house. They're not trying to be overly fussy with, you know, an average homeowner. There's also something that we didn't talk about, which is a hardship relief. If there's the slate roof example is a good one. This comes up occasionally in Hamlin Park because they do still have some slate roofs over there. The average homeowner cannot afford to replace a slate roof, and Preservation Board understands that, and they do work with people on things like that. So again, there's not a blanket yes or no to any of these questions. It is very individual, but again, all I can tell you is this year, the statistic is 2/3 of the projects never go before the Preservation Board. They're just approved at the staff level.
All right, thank you very much, Jessie. And so, Christy, you showed us that map, but one of the questions is about the boundaries of the district, and how would the boundaries of a district be set? How does one think about those? Are there natural boundaries? So if you want to go back to the map and just cover that a little bit more in detail.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, taking a big step backwards to, you know, like Jessie said in the beginning, there was a survey, a historic resource survey, a massive survey of this broader area. And based on that survey work many, many years ago is how they determined these boundaries for the National Register District. There's a lot of different factors that go into determining the boundaries of the historic districts. You know, quite honestly, this is an entire class in grad school to teach you how to figure out what boundaries and how to create boundaries. So it's definitely not something I'm going to be able to teach you guys tonight, but it factors in not just the actual land masses and the development patterns and the street grid. It also factors in the cultural and historical importance and events that have to do with that area. So there's a lot of nitty-gritty work that goes into defining those boundaries. And especially with a historic district as large as this one, there definitely was, you know, I wasn't here in the city of Buffalo at the time, but I know from the paperwork, there was a lot of back and forth of, well, does this include and should this be included or not? So this is the boundaries that were determined at that time. The reason you would want the boundaries, why it is a good practice to have your boundaries the same for your National Register level and your local level, is you alleviate that confusion of, am I in this one? Am I in that one? What do I have to follow? And the biggest example of that in real life here in the city of Buffalo would be the Allentown Historic District. The original Allentown Historic District that was created, the first one was I actually believe the local one was made first. And it was one particular area that in the 70s or the early 80s was what they defined Allentown as. Over the years, that local district changed and morphed. And then they later created a national level designation for that. But that original National Register district had completely different boundaries than the local historic district. So there was a lot of confusion for about 2 decades of, am I in this one? Am I in that one? What rules do I have to follow? And so then the state and community leaders got together in the early 2000s, and they actually reopened those historic districts, primarily the National Register Historic District, and rewrote that and renominated it so that the current boundaries of the local designation and the national level designation have pretty much the exact same boundaries today. So again, when you buy a property in Allentown, you know that you are going to be within a locally landmarked and a National Register landmark district. For other historic districts that are in the city, they have a little bit more cleaner lines to them than the Elmwood Village and Allentown. One major example would be Hamlin Park. Hamlin Park has a very nice uniform, nice clean lines to that historic district. And those are the same boundaries on the local level and on the National Register level. So yeah, that's my answer for that. I think I answered it. I hope so.
Thank you, Christy. I hope that you teach us a class on that soon.
The other thing
for that, if you're interested.
Point out with that, Tia, can I interrupt? Because I did notice one of the questions in the chat was, what level of support would you need? And there's two, actually, you probably only meant one type of support, but I say there's two types actually inherent in that question that have to do with Christy's answer. If you want to submit a local landmark application that basically mirrors the National Register nomination. That's actually a pretty easy lift for us, setting aside the political support for a moment. But from a technical standpoint, basically the nomination is already done. So there's work that we would need to help you with to get it into the right format for the city, because it's a different, of course, format than the national piece. But essentially the work is done. The research is done. The boundaries here, we can just lift all that information, put it in a local application, write a check for $500 and submit it. So we could do that. I know we're going to talk about next steps at the end. So that could be done at any point. Take us a couple weeks to get done. If you want to have a conversation about different boundaries, well, now, as Christy said, now you're opening up that survey can of worms, because it has to make sense, right? You can't just say, well, we just happen to like this street or that street. Like, it actually has to meet one of those criteria. You have to build a case for it. So then you're looking at probably bringing in a consultant or getting a level of staffing support from us that would require some additional financial support to help you figure out a different boundary. So I want to put that out there, both on the boundary question as well as on that question about level of support. The other piece,
right,
I think
that's exactly, I was going to say, I'm staying with you, Jesse, so I'm glad you popped in. Can you tell us what's the level of support needed for the designation of a local historic district?
So there's no real answer to that question, Tia and Liz, who asked that question. Again, like so many other things, it really depends. So in the Elmwood Village, you actually have two different council people. So there's no question that the Preservation Board itself would pass this designation. It's pretty cut and dry. It's already on the National Register. So it has those local technical things that the Preservation Board is looking for. Then it goes to the Common Council, and that's where it's really individual to different council members. What level of dissension in a neighborhood, does it have to be completely overwhelming support, or are they there with you? Do they understand the issues and they're willing to take a couple knocks from some folks because they understand how important the issue is? So that really comes down to an individual council member. You have two council members who would have to approve this, right? You have David Rivera for the southern end, and then you have council member Ferletto for the northern part of the district. So, you have some political work cut out for you there. And that's really a question of meeting with them, finding out what their comfort level is. I really do think you'd have to do some additional work to make sure that you have community support, but we can talk more about that at the end. But it's not like with the National Register where they want to see 51% support. It's really individual to the council members.
Okay. And then this is an interesting one, I think. From PBN's perspective, that's us. Does the Elmwood Village have what it would take in terms of history? Does a National Register district automatically mean the Elmwood Village would have a better chance? And I say it's interesting just because as a resident of Buffalo, I'm surprised that it's not a local historic district already.
I mean, it's not an automatic, each level of designation, the local level and the National Register have their own criteria. So I showed you guys on that screen that there's 9 different criteria that you have to meet one or more of on the local level. On the National Register side, they actually only have 4 criteria. If you took all of the 9 that the city of Buffalo has for local landmarking and kind of like melted them down into and categorized them a little bit better, they would equal the 4 categories that exist on the National Register side. So that it's not necessarily if it meets one level or the other level that it automatically can meet the criteria for the opposite level, but it's very high likelihood if you're able to successfully meet the National Register criteria for your significance, either on because they take things that are not just national level significance, it can be a state level significance or a local level significance. So if you're able to successfully meet those National Register criteria for listing, then I would think it's pretty safe that you would successfully meet the local level criteria. That's not necessarily the case the opposite way around. I think with the local level criteria, the reason we have 9 of them, the reason that there are more of them is because preservation on the local level is what we define it. If we say and take that moment and say that we value these things and we you know, we think it meets these criteria and we can have that information and research to support that opinion, there's a lot more ability to landmark things on that local level that maybe the National Park Service might not agree with. But I mean, yeah, I mean, the National Register is our national list of all of the properties, all of the resources that are, you know, important, significant, and historic, and worthy of preservation. So if we have a resource on the National Register and have that designation, why wouldn't we want it to have that local protection? Especially from a financial point of view, the Elmwood Village already has, you know, can use those historic tax credits. Many property owners in the Elmwood Village have already used those tax credits. Many developers and income producing property owners have used those commercial credits to improve their property. Why wouldn't you want that local level protection to protect your financial investment in your property? You use the tax credits to do this wonderful job to rehabilitate your property. There's no guarantee that that investment will stay after your ownership because there is not that protection on the local level for that investment. So from a financial point of view, there's a logical reason to want that local level designation to protect that financial investment that you've made.
Thank you. Just a reminder to everybody who's still listening, I'm a good DJ, not a bad DJ. All requests will get played. Send your questions. This is another one where I'm just always like, because you know that my background is not in preservation, although it is growing. I'm interested in the adjectives as well. And somebody asked, how is original generally determined?
Again, that is really, that's a hypothetical question that is hard to answer hypothetically. So it really depends on what resource you're talking about in an individual house. But when we're talking about those original character defining features, it's going to be the items that were either included and put on that building when it was originally constructed. So those original wood windows, those original corbels, any of those decorative elements, not just the little decorative elements, but the overall massing and organization of the house. So your window pattern, your fenestration pattern, that is an original character of your house. If you had 3 windows on top, 2 windows on the bottom, and a door, that symmetry of your front facade is an original character of your house. So it's not just the little elements, it's also just the overall form and massing of your property.
So it's more about which components exist still from the beginning.
Yeah, but again, you might have elements that it's not the original piece of wood that was put on your house in 1890, but it was rehabbed correctly over the years. And so it might be a new wood window that you have in there, but it still counts as the original fabric because it's still the original style wood window that was in there. It's still in the keeping of those original elements there.
Maintaining what's from the beginning. Understood.
Yeah. But again, you know, really nitty gritty of answering that question, it really depends on what element we're talking about on what building. So we can look at, well, is that original? There's a lot of houses out there that have really great decorative elements on there that were actually not built originally on it, that those were later adding, you know, someone really loved corbels or they really loved brackets and they put a bunch of more brackets on their house. So again, with that house, when we look at wanting to change elements or make exterior changes to it, are those original from the beginning of construction or were those later additions that kind of create a false sense of history on that building? Those aren't the same style, you know, so it really depends on like what we're talking about in that building. But, you know, the short answer, the easy answer is yes, those original things that were there when the architect or the builder stopped building the building in the 1800s or whatever year it was, those are all the original elements.
Thank you. Has the Preservation Board historically supported historic preservation where developers are concerned?
That's an interesting phrasing of a question. The Preservation Board does support historic preservation. That's their job. They have a very specific charge. The Preservation Board uses the Secretary of the Interior's standards to evaluate projects. So, yeah, and I would say that Preservation Board, again, one place you'll have to definitely look for some pushback from if this is a path you decide to go down, are the developers, because they do understand that the Preservation Board will hold their feet to the fire. That is what the Preservation Board does. So again, the example at the end of my, street, with the People Link project, that came in with one design. It was on a vacant lot, so there wasn't anything to be torn down. It was just a new building, but it came in with one design. It got approved with another design because that design fit in better with the historic character of the street. When it comes to demolitions, I mean, yes, the Preservation Board has allowed demolitions in local historic districts, but you have to meet a certain burden of proof that says that either that resource is not contributing to the district in some way, or that the financial hurdles are very high. And unlike with some of the other boards, the planning board or the zoning board, there really are specific ways that gets evaluated. So the Preservation Board really does take its job seriously, and they are looking out for what's best for that historic district and maintaining the overall character of that historic district, whether that's from new builds or from altering the existing fabric.
And just to elaborate on that a tiny bit, Jesse brought up the concept of hardship. So again, when you have two applications that are coming before the Preservation Board, they're the same exact size of house, same style of house. They both have slate roofs, and they're both asking to replace with an asphalt shingle saying that they cannot afford to repair and keep that slate roof. So they need to use a different modern material. If you have one of those applications coming from a single family, an owner occupant, and they can, they show that it's just beyond their means, that hardship is kind of evaluated in one way where you have a big corporation, a developer, how the documentation that they would have to prove to show that they meet a hardship versus a single family homeowner, they evaluate and take those consideration that if you are a big company that has the money to be able to afford this work, they might evaluate that and hold you a little bit stricter to those standards than maybe especially, I think the example that we always use is a retired little old lady who just wants to put a new roof on her house. There's a lot more wiggle room in that hardship when we're talking about a single family house and home owner occupied than as an investment property, saying that you have a hardship with being able to do that work. So taking that, again, all of those details are very specific to the cases at hand, but understanding that hardship and how the Preservation Board evaluates that is important to that question as well.
Nice, thank you very much, team. I think this next one is a yes or no. So is anyone currently working on making Elmwood Village a local historic district?
Well, are there more questions after that?
There sure are.
Oh, let's hold that one to the end.
Let's hold that one for the end, because that segues us to our next to bring.
Okay, but do not forget, please. This one is really specific. It is about the Crane Library, and you might know that they are trying to alter the front. I know that, so I assume that you two know that, because you are the brains of the operation. Would this change or get in the way, I guess, of putting the plan for the elevator in the front of the building?
All right, am I answering? Because I can answer it.
Anyone really.
So, okay, again, when your landmarked exterior changes have to go before the Preservation Board. Something that we have to keep in mind, not just in regard to the Preservation Board, but other avenues of required municipal review of projects involving our built environment. The city doesn't have to get permits. So the city and state, if it's a state-owned property, don't need to come and get many times do, out of courtesy, come to the Preservation Board to get their advice on how to best complete their project, but they are not required to get permit review. So in this case, unfortunately, a local landmarking would not, depending on what side of the argument you're on, whether you're for or against the elevator or the placement, the local landmarking would not really impact that project, where there can be impact in that project is through a separate process, because the money that's going to be used to do that project is going to be state funding or federal funding to put that elevator in. And so because that state money or federal money is being used that would impact a historic resource, because that is a resource that is listed on the National Register, it would kick off what's called a Section 106 review, or there's another state level review as well. So it would kick off these reviews required by state and federal law to see how that federal money or state money or permission would impact the historic resources. So through those processes, we would have an opportunity in the community to voice our opinion on whether or not that elevator is built and where it could go, and mitigating things that could be done to make that project the best that it can be. But unfortunately, because it's a publicly owned building and the situation around that, it wouldn't impact it. If we change that situation to be a private owned building and they wanted to slap an elevator on the front of it, yeah, that would go before the Preservation Board. The Preservation Board would consider that application using the Secretary of the Interior standards and probably ask them to maybe choose a more sympathetic place to put that elevator, or to give recommendations of how to change that to be more sympathetic to that structure. But unfortunately, because it's a municipal, it's a government-owned building, there isn't that much that the local landmarking would affect that situation.
Thank you, Christy. I feel like the answer to this question is sometimes. It is, are developers who have buildings in the Elmwood Village also community members?
I'm assuming they mean for the purpose of, community support. I mean, we can all sing the "Who Are the People in Your Neighborhood" song, and I think developers would probably be included in that. But yes, I mean, they definitely, folks who own property are going to have a say in whether or not this district goes forward. They will have the same opportunity that a homeowner will have to talk to their council person, testify in front of the Preservation Board and the Common Council. And so again, if and some developers don't mind, some developers will be against. And so again, that's something to take into consideration. And that goes back to the question of, community support and getting the support of your council person. And again, that can be look very different in different council districts. So that's a localized question, but yeah, they'll get a say just the exact same way a homeowner will get a say. It's not a vote. There's no, this many people said yes, this many people said no. It'll come down to the feeling of the council members of how it is supported or not supported, and how that impacts their ability to be elected, frankly, at the end of the day.
Because ultimately, yes, that is the reality of this process. But actually, I mean, the letter of the law is these nominations should go through and get approved if they successfully meet the criteria. So I think that, this application, we would successfully meet many of the criteria in the designation. And that's the focus, is that it's not what I as a private property owner want or not want for my building. It's this does successfully meet the criteria. And that is one of those talking points that you want to emphasize when you have these conversations with elected officials. It's not about my likes or dislikes or other people's likes or dislikes with what they want to do. It's, does this meet the criteria, and whether or not that's successful or not.
Well, thank you for your frankness, Jesse, mostly.
Political science major here.
I promise you the answer to this is not yes, no, or sometimes. What is being done to change the regulations to allow us to have benefits to promote historic preservation?
Well, I don't think we do need to change the regulations. You already have them. I mean, that tax credit will save you 20% off of any work that you do to your home, and only 5% of that work has to be on the exterior. So you can get a new furnace as long as you pair it with, painting your house. So, you can still do the 20% off that. Again, the benefits to being on the National Register in the city of Buffalo. I noticed there's a question about Williamsville, that's a whole separate animal. But in the city of Buffalo, the benefits to being on the National Register, there's probably not going to be a stronger incentive than that. And again, I would strongly encourage you to do Christy's class and learn how to apply that benefit to you. So there's not an additional benefit for the local landmarking, but you already have the benefit. Sometimes we're working in districts that are local districts who would like to get that benefit and become on the National Register. And that can be a sticky wicket depending on, you know, criteria and all kinds of things, but you guys already have that benefit. So we're not really trying to change it.
The benefit you're missing is the opportunity for the public to voice their opinion and to try to shape those demolition projects, those new projects that many residents don't like or have issues with or want to at least have an input in. That's the things that right now you have no input really. You know, there's a couple of opportunities at the planning board maybe, but there really isn't. And here at the preservation board, there would be that extra level of opportunity for you as neighbors to voice your opinion on whether or not that project successfully meets the Secretary of the Interior standards or not.
Thank you. I believe we're on our final question, and it feels a bit broad, but does Erie County, and that's capitalized, so I think that they're talking about our government, play a role in historic preservation?
No, not really. New York State is a home rule state. So like Christy said earlier, preservation is really part of the zoning code, and that gets regulated at the municipal level. So it's really about, for any city or town or village that you're in, that's the level at which land use is regulated in New York State. So there's not really much of a role for Erie County. They do some great, they fund us. They fund lots of historic properties, organizations, cultural organizations that are housed in historic property. They own some historic properties, but in terms of the conversation that we're having, in terms of a regulatory aspect or anything like that, that's not typically a government layer that we work with directly for these kinds of things.
Thank you very much. And I believe that concludes our Q&A, and I have just launched our final poll. Please take it.
So now we'll invite Gretchen and Linda from Rev as well to come back if you want to turn your cameras on to go over this final poll. And then from Rev's point of view, what are these next steps? Where do you guys see happening forward?
Yes, hi, it's Linda Gelman. There are a group of us that are ready to put in an application, and I guess what the next steps are is what we need to know to go from there, which you have gone through. Is there any more specifics that we need to know?
As far as next steps, we really need to determine from this poll, we're going to take a look at it, and we're going to collaborate with Preservation Buffalo Niagara. We are going to, we don't want to, time is of the essence here, because the longer we wait to take action, we are losing our historic resources. They're literally coming down around us. And I think when we initially had this conversation several years ago, we felt that starting to happen and kind of felt that maybe we could do some more advocacy and see how that went, and it has not gone well. So we're really up against some very powerful developers who have a lot of tools in their toolbox, and we need some tools in ours. And so what we're thinking about doing is that we will take a look at what your responses are to this poll and see how the group is leaning here and what the thoughts are, do some more community outreach. We do have everyone's email addresses who participated tonight, and we'll be reaching out to you. And hopefully in early 2021, we will be ready to decide what the path is. I really feel representing the work that the residents of the Elmwood Village group has done for several years, that this is the best option for us. And I know that there are many people that I've seen who are participating tonight who've been asking for years and years, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we doing this? And so the response is, it's time. It's time to stop talking about it and to actually begin the process of moving forward. So hopefully we will be able to have the support of as many community members as possible. Like anything, you know, it'll unlikely be unanimous, but we have to take steps to protect the generations who are going to live in this neighborhood long after us. So I just want to thank again PBN for partnering with us on this, for all of your knowledge and expertise. We've got the passion and the fire in our bellies, but you guys know how to really do it. So we appreciate that. And anyone is welcome to, like I said, you know, come on to our Residency Elmwood Village page. We are trying to keep it to people who are stakeholders in the neighborhood itself, because that has the most resonance as we move forward. But we hope that you get involved, and we look forward to what those next steps might be.
And just to clarify, it seems some people don't know what the Blue Ribbon Panel is. And it is a group put together by Sean Ryan and David Rivera to try and come up with recommendations to strengthen preservation in the city of Buffalo.
Excellent. So with that, make sure you fill out, answer that community poll, and we're like Gretchen said, we're catching all of those answers, and then you'll hear from Rev or PBN in the near future. So with that, we are ending for the evening. Thank you so much for attending. We'll leave the room open for a little bit if you have any last questions that you want to put in the chat, and we can follow up with you. But otherwise, thank you so very much for spending this evening with us, and have a great rest of your week. Good night.
Thank you for all your expertise. It was great. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Good night.
Night.
Good, Ms. Jessie.